Hello, BC real estate lovers. Welcome to this practice session on Chapter 19, Taxes on Real Property. Whether you're studying for an exam or just want to strengthen your understanding, this video will guide you through 25 essential practice questions covering property taxation, assessments, exemptions, and more. Test your knowledge, challenge yourself, and get one step closer to mastering real property taxes. Grab a notebook, follow along, and see how many you can get right. Let's dive in. Question 1. Which one of the following factors would make a property owner eligible to apply for deferral of real property taxes under the regular program? Correct answer, C. The property owner is a widower. Explanation. The regular program for deferral of real property taxes typically allows property owners who meet specific criteria to defer their property taxes. One of the key eligibility criteria is if the property owner is a widow or widower. Option 1. Member of Parliament, not eligible under this program. Option 2. Divorcee, not eligible under this program. Option 4. War veteran, not specifically eligible for deferral under this regular program. Final answer. Option 3 is correct because widowers or widows can apply for tax deferral on their principal place of residence. Question 2. Yang was the owner of an office building in downtown Vancouver. She recently sold the building to Ashley for $100 million. Ashley did not pay the GST on the sale, and Yang has just received an assessment for the GST due on the sale of the property from the Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, worth $5 million. Which of the following statements is false? Option C is a false statement here, which states that if Yang files an objection and it is affirmed by an appeals officer at the CRA, Yang has exhausted her options in terms of appealing the assessment. Explanation. The false statement here is option C. If Yang files an objection and the CRA's appeals officer affirms the assessment, she still has the option to appeal further. Specifically, she could appeal to the Tax Court of Canada within 90 days of the decision, and then potentially to the Federal Court of Appeal and even the Supreme Court of Canada if necessary. Option 1 is true because the CRA can collect the $5 million GST assessment immediately. Option 2 is true. Yang has 90 days to file an objection if she wishes to dispute the assessment. Option 4 is true. Yang can pursue Ashley for the GST that was not collected at the time of sale. As the GST, liability can shift to the seller in certain circumstances. Conclusion. Option 3 is false because Yang can still appeal the assessment after the appeals officer's decision. Question 3. When can an appeal be made to the Supreme Court of British Columbia regarding a real property assessment value? Correct answer, B. After receipt of the Property Assessment Appeal Board decision, and then only on a point of law. Explanation. An appeal to the Supreme Court of British Columbia can only be made after the Property Assessment Appeal Board has issued its decision. Additionally, the appeal to the Supreme Court must be based solely on a point of law, i.e., a legal issue related to how the law was applied, rather than a question of fact or valuation. Option A is incorrect because the appeal process does not start immediately after receiving the assessment notice. The owner must first go through the Property Assessment Panel and the Property Assessment Appeal Board. Option C is incorrect because appeals can be made to the Supreme Court, though only under specific conditions. Option D is incorrect because appeals from the Property Assessment Review Panel go to the Property Assessment Appeal Board, not directly to the Supreme Court. Final answer, option 2, is correct because an appeal to the Supreme Court can only happen after a decision by the Property Assessment Appeal Board, and it must focus on a legal issue. Question 4. A complaint against the amount of a real property assessment might proceed through hearings by the 4 different bodies listed below. The correct order of these hearings would be option 2. B. Property Assessment Review Panels, then A. Property Assessment Appeal Board, then D. Supreme Court of British Columbia, finally C. Court of Appeal. Explanation. Option 2 is correct because Part 4 of the Assessment Act provides for the establishment of Property Assessment Review Panels as the first level of appeal from property assessments. Any person who is dissatisfied with the Property Assessment Review Panel's decision may appeal to the Property Assessment Appeal Board. An appeal on a point of law may subsequently be made from the Property Assessment Appeal Board to the Supreme Court of British Columbia. Finally, an appeal can be made from the Supreme Court of British Columbia to the Court of Appeal, but only on a point of law raised by the lower court judge. Options 1, 3, and 4 are incorrect for this reason. Question 5. In which of the following scenarios would the profit or capital gain realized upon the sale of property be most likely to be completely exempt from taxation? Correct answer D. The seller purchased the property to live in as their principal residence and lived on the property for 10 years. Explanation. The principal residence exemption allows for the complete exemption from capital gains tax when a property is sold, provided that it was the seller's primary residence for the entire period of ownership. In this case, the seller has lived in the property for 10 years as their principal residence, meaning the profit from the sale would likely be completely exempt from taxation. Option A is incorrect because purchasing the property as a long-term investment generally does not qualify for the principal residence exemption, and the profit may be subject to capital gains tax. Option B is incorrect because buying property for the purpose of flipping it, quick resale for profit, is treated as business income, which is taxable. Option C is incorrect because purchasing the property for rental income also doesn't qualify for the principal residence exemption. The profit from the sale may be subject to capital gains tax, depending on how the property is classified. Conclusion. Option D is correct because the sale of a property that was the seller's principal residence for 10 years would most likely be completely exempt from capital gains taxation. Question 6. Who may claim a homeowner grant? Correct answer D. The owner-occupier of a property. Explanation. To qualify for a homeowner grant, the person claiming it must be the owner-occupier of the property, meaning they must own and live in the property as their principal residence. Option A is incorrect because having a name on the assessment roll does not automatically qualify someone for the grant unless they are also living on the property. Option B is incorrect because tenants do not qualify for a homeowner grant, even if they have a lease exceeding 3 years. Option C is incorrect because an owner must occupy the property to qualify for the grant. Simply owning the property but not living in it does not make someone eligible. Conclusion. Option D is correct because the person claiming the grant must be the owner-occupier of the property. Question 7. In British Columbia's real property taxation system, the actual value of a property is, correct answer, D, the value shown on the assessment notice. Explanation. In British Columbia's real property taxation system, the actual value of a property is determined by the assessor's estimate and is shown on the assessment notice. This value is what the local government uses for property tax purposes. Option A is incorrect because the value at which a property last sold is not necessarily the same as its current actual value for tax purposes. Option B is incorrect because the amount of the tax burden is based on the assessed value but is not the actual value of the property itself. Option C is incorrect because the assessor's estimate of lending value is a different concept and does not determine the actual value for taxation purposes. Final answer. Option D is correct because the assessment notice shows the actual value of a property as determined by the assessor. Question 8. Which of the following occupiers of real property would not be liable by statute for the real property taxes? Correct answer B. The registered holder of a long-term lease where the lessor is not a tax-exempt organization or a public body. Explanation. In British Columbia, the statutory liability to pay real property taxes generally falls on the owner of the property. Here's how each option applies. A. The registered owner of a life estate. Incorrect. A life tenant is considered an owner under property tax law and is therefore statutorily liable for real property taxes. B. The registered holder of a long-term lease, where the lessor is not a tax-exempt organization or a public body. Correct. The owner, lessor, of the property is responsible for paying the real property taxes, not the tenant, lessee. Even though a lease can require the tenant to pay property taxes under contract law, this is not the same as statutory liability. C. The registered owner of an estate in fee simple. Incorrect. A person who owns a fee simple estate, the highest form of property ownership, is always statutorily liable for property taxes. D. The registered holder of an agreement for sale, incorrect. Under statutory law, the buyer under an agreement for sale is considered an owner and is therefore liable for property taxes. Conclusion. The registered holder of a long-term lease, where the lessor is not a tax-exempt organization or a public body. Question 9. Jennifer Joseph has lived alone in an apartment since the death of her husband 10 years ago. She has just turned 60 years of age, retired from her job as a bus driver, and wants to begin gardening as a hobby to fill in her retirement years. She has found a small house that is selling at a price she can afford because it is the only residential property in an area of commercial development. The present owners, who are anxious to sell, have lived in the house for about 20 years and have developed a magnificent garden which appeals very much to Mrs. Joseph. However, she is worried about having enough retirement income to meet the mortgage payments and the property tax payments if she uses all of her savings as a down payment. Which of the following statements is true? Correct answer C. Mrs. Joseph may make an application to defer payment of the net property tax under the regular program for as many years as she owns and resides in the house. Explanation. British Columbia's regular property tax deferral program allows eligible homeowners to defer up to 100% of their net property taxes. To qualify, Mrs. Joseph must be at least 55 years old. She is 60. Own and occupy the home as her principal residence. She intends to live there. Be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. Have at least 25% equity in the home. Be a widow. She is. Since she meets all the criteria, she can defer her property taxes for as long as she owns and resides in the home. Why the other options are incorrect. A. Mrs. Joseph should apply for a reverse annuity mortgage, RAM, because a RAM will require lower mortgage payments than a conventional mortgage. Incorrect. A reverse annuity mortgage, RAM, is only available to homeowners who already own their home, not those purchasing a new one. It allows older homeowners to receive income by borrowing against their home equity, not reducing mortgage payments. B. After Mrs. Joseph's purchase, the property will continue to have an assessed value for real property tax purposes, which is based on its value as a residential property. Incorrect. Normally, residential properties are assessed at their current residential use. However, because this house is the only residential property in a commercial area, it could be assessed based on its commercial development potential. Mrs. Joseph does not qualify for the special residential assessment under Section 19(8) of the Assessment Act because she has not lived there for at least 10 years. D. If Mrs. Joseph becomes an owner-occupier, the homeowner grants will allow reduction of her taxes to no more than $350. Incorrect. The basic homeowner grant can reduce property taxes, but cannot reduce them below $350. She does not qualify for additional reductions beyond the basic grant. Question 10. In which of the following scenarios would the City of Vancouver's empty homes tax most likely apply? Option A. The owner spends the summer, from June to August, living in the property as a principal residence. For the remainder of the year, she lists the property on Airbnb exclusively for weekend trips. She does not have a hotel or Band B license is correct. Explanation. The City of Vancouver's empty homes tax, EHT, applies to properties that are not occupied as a principal residence for at least 6 months per year and are not rented out for long-term leases, at least 30 days per term, for at least 6 months total. A. The owner only lives there for 3 months and rents short-term on Airbnb. To avoid the EHT, the owner must either live in the home for at least 6 months as a principal residence or rent it out for at least 6 months, 30-day minimum per term. Problem: the owner only lives there for 3 months, and the rest of the time, the Airbnb rentals are shorter than 30 days, which does not count as a long-term rental. Without a hotel or Band B license, the property is considered vacant and the EHT applies. Why the other options are incorrect. B. The owner lives abroad, but he rents the property for 6 30-day terms throughout the year in order to avoid paying the empty homes tax. Incorrect. The property is rented out for at least 6 months, with a minimum of 30 days per rental period. This meets the exemption criteria, so the EHT does not apply. C. The owner uses the property as a principal residence, but spends up to 6 months of the year abroad on business trips. Incorrect. As long as the owner considers the property their principal residence, the EHT does not apply, even if they travel for up to 6 months. The property is still legally occupied, so it is exempt from the tax. D. The owners initially purchased the property as an investment, but now that their daughter has started attending university in Vancouver, she uses the property as a principal residence from September to April of the same year. Incorrect. The EHT does not apply if a family member, like a child, lives in the property as their principal residence for at least 6 months. Since the daughter lives there for 8 months, September to April, the property qualifies for exemption. Question 11. Which of the following statutes affects the real property taxation system in British Columbia? Correct answer, B. The School Act. Explanation. The real property taxation system in British Columbia is governed by multiple statutes, one of which is the School Act. The School Act provides for real property taxation to fund public education in British Columbia. A portion of property taxes collected from property owners goes toward funding public schools across the province. This makes the School Act a key piece of legislation affecting property taxation in BC. Why the other options are incorrect? A. The Real Estate Services Act. Incorrect. This regulates real estate professionals, e.g. realtors, brokers, and real estate transactions, but does not deal with property taxation. C. The Arbitration Act. Incorrect. This governs arbitration proceedings, alternative dispute resolution, in legal disputes, but does not impact property taxes. D. The Land Transfer Form Act. Incorrect. This deals with property ownership transfers and the forms required for land title registration, but it does not regulate taxation. Question 12. What is an assessment notice? Correct answer, C. A notice that informs the property owner of the actual value of their property. Explanation. An assessment notice is a document that informs a property owner of the assessed value of their property. The assessed value is determined by BC assessment as of July 1st of the previous year. This value is used to calculate property taxes, but is not a tax bill. Why the other options are incorrect. A. A demand for payment of a specified amount of property taxes. Incorrect. A tax notice, not an assessment notice, is issued when property taxes are due. The assessment notice does not demand payment, but simply states the assessed value. B. A notice issued by the municipality stating the date on which the assessor will appraise your property. Incorrect. BC. Assessment does not issue advance notices for when a property will be appraised. Assessments are done automatically each year. D. A notice of the cost to the property owner of a local improvement project. Incorrect. A local improvement levy, not an assessment notice, informs property owners of costs for municipal improvements like sidewalks or street upgrades. Question 13. Which of the following properties is most likely to be valued at market value for the purposes of real property taxation? Correct answer, C. A residential property located in Vancouver. Explanation. In British Columbia, real property is generally assessed at market value unless special rules apply. Market value is the price a property would likely sell for on the open market as of July 1st of the previous year. Residential properties in cities like Vancouver are typically assessed at market value because they do not qualify for special exemptions or assessment methods. Why the other options are incorrect. A. A property that is being used and is classified as farmland. Incorrect. Farmland is assessed based on its agricultural value, not market value. The classification system ensures farmers are taxed fairly, ignoring development potential. B. A property with a pipeline that has been categorized as industrial land. Incorrect. Industrial land, especially with pipelines, often has a special assessment formula. Market value is not always used due to its unique use and regulations. D. A property that is being used for a specialized utility project. Incorrect. Utility properties, e.g. power plants, water treatment facilities, are assessed using special valuation methods. These methods often reflect the regulated nature of these assets rather than market forces. Question 14. Which of the following real estate purchases is most likely to be a violation of the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act? Correct answer, B. Mario, an American citizen, purchases a townhouse which he plans to rent to a Canadian citizen. Explanation. The Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act, commonly called the Foreign Buyers Ban, restricts non-Canadians from purchasing certain types of residential properties in Canada. Mario is a non-Canadian since he is an American citizen. He is purchasing a townhouse, which qualifies as a residential property under the Act. There are no exemptions for non-Canadians buying residential property for rental purposes. Since Mario's purchase does not fall into an exemption, he is likely violating the Act. Why the other options are incorrect. A. Austin, a Chinese citizen, purchases a commercial building which currently contains a coffee shop and 3 clothing stores. Incorrect. Commercial properties are not covered by the Act. Since Austin is buying a purely commercial property, the Act does not apply. C. Christina, a Canadian permanent resident, purchases a residential strata unit for her and her children to live in. Incorrect. Permanent residents are not considered non-Canadians under the Act. Christina is legally allowed to purchase residential property. D. Joseph, a Polish citizen, purchases a non-strata apartment building. Incorrect. The Act does not apply to the purchase of multi-unit rental buildings, e.g., non-strata apartment buildings. Joseph is buying a type of property that is exempt, so the purchase is legal. Question 15. If you consider the value shown on your assessment notice too high, you may make a formal complaint to. Correct answer. A. The Property Assessment Review Panel. Explanation. If a property owner believes the assessed value on their assessment notice is too high, they must file a formal complaint with the Property Assessment Review Panel, PARP. The PARP is the first level of appeal under British Columbia's Assessment Act. Property owners must submit their complaint before January 31st of the assessment year. Why the other options are incorrect. B. The Board of Variance any time prior to the end of the year. Incorrect. The Board of Variance deals with zoning and land use variances, not property assessments. Property owners must appeal their assessment by January 31st, not any time before year end. C. The Municipal Council. Incorrect. The Municipal Council has no authority over property assessments. Assessments are handled by BC Assessment and the PARP, not local governments. D. The Assessment Appeal Court. Incorrect. There is no Assessment Appeal Court in British Columbia. The correct appeal process is 1. Property Assessment Review Panel, PARP, first level of appeal. 2. Property Assessment Appeal Board, PAAB, if still dissatisfied after Part P. 3. Supreme Court of BC, only for legal issues, not value disputes. Question 16. Helen is the owner and occupier of a detached 2-bedroom house in Vancouver. Which of the following statements regarding property taxes on Helen's property is false? Correct answer. A is a false statement here. The Assessment Act is the sole source of statute law governing taxation of real property in British Columbia. Explanation. The real property taxation system in British Columbia is governed by multiple statutes, not just the Assessment Act. While the Assessment Act is important, other laws, such as the School Act, the Local Government Act, and the Community Charter, also play a role in property taxation. Since the question asks for the false statement, option A is correct because it is not true. Why the other options are true. Incorrect choices. B. Helen may have higher annual net property tax liability if she moves to Toronto but keeps her home in Vancouver for her mother to live in. True statement. The homeowner grant is only available for properties that are the owner's principal residence. If Helen moves away, she loses eligibility for the homeowner grant. This results in higher net property tax liability. C. The municipality can appeal the assessment if they believe the original assessed value is too low. True statement. Under the Assessment Act, anyone, including municipalities, can appeal a property's assessment. If a municipality believes a property's value is underassessed, they can challenge it. D. Helen may apply for a special assessment for her home to be assessed based on its current residential use. True statement. Section 19(8) of the Assessment Act allows special assessments for homeowners who 1. Have lived in their home for 10+ years. 2. Have seen their neighborhood rezoned for higher density housing. Since Helen meets both criteria, she qualifies for a special assessment based on her home's current residential use. Question 17. If you consider that the value shown on your assessment notice is too high, you can make a formal complaint to the correct answer, D, Property Assessment Review Panel. Explanation. If you believe your property's assessed value is too high or too low, you must first submit a formal complaint to the Property Assessment Review Panel, PARP, under the Assessment Act. The PARP is the first level of appeal for property assessment disputes. Why the other options are incorrect? A. Municipal court, incorrect. There is no municipal court for property assessment complaints. Property tax disputes are handled through the appeal process, not the courts. B. Court of Appeal, incorrect. The Court of Appeal does not handle assessment notice complaints. It only reviews legal errors from lower court decisions. C. Assessment Commissioner, incorrect. While the Assessment Commissioner oversees property assessments, formal complaints are not submitted directly to them. Instead, complaints must be submitted to the Property Assessment Review Panel first. Question 18. Which of the following factors is generally not considered in determining whether or not profit realized on the sale of a property 18 months after it was purchased is treated as business income rather than a capital gain for taxation purposes? Correct answer, C. The nature of the buyer who purchased the property. Explanation. When determining whether the profit from the sale of a property is treated as business income or a capital gain for taxation purposes, factors related to the seller's actions and intentions are considered. However, the nature of the buyer is not a factor. The intention of the seller when purchasing the property, the financing method, and the length of ownership are all relevant to determining whether the profit is business income or a capital gain. Business income is generally earned when the sale is part of a business activity, whereas capital gains are typically earned from the sale of an asset held for investment or personal use. Why the other options are incorrect? A. The intention of the owner at the time they purchased the property. Incorrect. The intention at the time of purchase is a key factor in determining whether the sale generates business income or capital gain. B. The method of financing used to purchase the property. Incorrect. The financing method, e.g., using borrowed funds, can be considered in determining whether the sale is part of a business venture. D. The length of time the seller owned the property. Incorrect. While the holding period, length of ownership, is not the sole factor, it can be considered. Generally, short-term ownership might indicate a business activity, especially if the property is sold within a relatively short period of time after purchase. Question 19. Which of the following statements is false regarding GST? False statement here is A. Transactions will only be subject to GST if they are expressly listed in the legislation as a transaction for which GST applies. Explanation. The GST, Goods and Services Tax, in Canada is a value-added tax that applies to most transactions unless a specific exemption or exclusion is provided under the Excise Tax Act. This means that GST applies to all transactions by default unless explicitly exempted, rather than only to transactions that are listed in the legislation as subject to GST. Why the other options are correct? B. GST is a value-added tax. True. GST is indeed a value-added tax because it is charged at each stage of production or distribution based on the value added at each stage. C. Compared to income tax, GST has a relatively low rate of taxation. True. The rate of GST, currently 5% in Canada, is generally lower than income taxes, which can range much higher depending on the income bracket. D. GST is imposed under the Excise Tax Act. True. The Excise Tax Act is the piece of Canadian federal legislation that governs the implementation and collection of GST. Question 20. Which of the following would likely not fall under the definition of a residential complex under the Excise Tax Act? Correct answer, D. A home that is used for short-term rentals on Airbnb. Explanation. Under the Excise Tax Act, a residential complex generally refers to properties that are used for residential purposes as a place to live. However, homes used for short-term rentals, like on Airbnb, might be considered more like hotel units than permanent residential complexes, thus falling outside the typical definition of a residential complex. Why the other options are correct? A. Land that is reasonably necessary for the use and enjoyment of the complex as a place of residence. True. Land that is necessary for the enjoyment of a residence, such as a yard or garage, is included as part of a residential complex under the Excise Tax Act. B. A detached home in which a family resides. True. A detached home used by a family as a residence falls squarely within the definition of a residential complex. C. A condominium unit being rented out to a university student on a year-long lease. True. A condominium rented for residential purposes, even if it's a rental, is considered a residential complex. Question 21. Whose responsibility is it under the Assessment Act to establish actual value? Correct answer. D. The assessor. Explanation. Under the Assessment Act in British Columbia, it is the assessor's responsibility to determine and establish the actual value of real property. The assessor is tasked with valuing properties for tax purposes based on factors such as market value, property characteristics, and comparable sales data. Why the other options are incorrect. A. The local municipal council. The municipal council does not establish the actual value of property. They set the tax rate for each class of property but do not determine its assessed value. B. The British Columbia Financial Services Authority. This entity does not have a role in establishing property values under the Assessment Act. C. The Lieutenant Governor and Council. The Lieutenant Governor and Council appoints members of the Property Assessment Appeal Board, but is not responsible for setting property values. Question 22. Which of the following statements is false regarding the seller's obligations surrounding GST in a transaction for the sale of real estate? Correct answer, D. If the seller receives an assessment from the Canada Revenue Agency for the amount of the GST after failing to collect it from the buyer, the seller has lost their ability to pursue the buyer for the amount of the tax and will be held fully liable for the amount. Explanation. The statement in D is false because even if the seller receives an assessment from the Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, for the uncollected GST, the seller retains the right to pursue the buyer for the amount of the tax. The seller is still held responsible for collecting GST, but can recover the amount from the buyer, depending on the situation. Why the other options are correct. A. Sellers are generally required to collect GST from the buyer as an agent for the government. Correct. Sellers are indeed required to act as agents for the government by collecting GST from the buyer on applicable real estate transactions. B. Where a seller fails to collect GST from the buyer, the seller becomes equally liable to the government for the amount of the tax. Correct. If the seller fails to collect GST, the seller is still responsible for paying the tax to the government. C. When the seller collects GST from the buyer, it is deemed to be held in trust for the government until it is remitted. Correct. The collected GST is held in trust by the seller and must be remitted to the government as required. Question 23. In establishing the actual value of a residential property for tax assessment purposes, the assessor may consider, correct answer, D, a comprehensive list of factors including all of those mentioned above. Explanation. The assessor may consider a broad range of factors when establishing the actual value of a residential property for tax assessment purposes. These factors include, but are not limited to, the present use of the property, the location of the property, the rental value of the property, original cost, replacement cost, and other market influences like selling price, economic obsolescence, and functional obsolescence. Thus, D is correct as it includes all of the possible factors the assessor can consider. Why the other options are incorrect. A. The present use of the property. Incorrect. While the present use is a key factor, it is only one of many that the assessor may consider in determining actual value. B. The location of the property. Incorrect. The location is another important factor, but like the present use, it is only part of the bigger picture. C. The rental value of the property. Incorrect. The rental value is also considered, but it is just one of the many factors used by the assessor. Question 24. If a property owner considers that the actual value assessment of their property is too high, they must first submit their complaint to correct answer, A, a property assessment review panel. Why the other options are incorrect. B, the Board of Variance. The Board of Variance handles exceptions to zoning bylaws and does not deal with property assessments. C, The Municipal Finance Authority. The Municipal Finance Authority is responsible for financing local governments but does not handle property assessments or complaints. D. The Property Assessment Appeal Board. The Property Assessment Appeal Board is the second level of appeal. If the owner is dissatisfied with the decision of the Property Assessment Review Panel, they can then appeal to this board. Question 25. Which of the following statements is true regarding GST in a transaction for the sale of real estate? Correct answer. A. GST generally does not apply to the amount of the deposit until the closing date. Explanation. In a real estate transaction, GST typically applies to the full sale price of the property at the closing date, not on the deposit amount until that time. This means the deposit is not subject to GST until the transaction officially closes and the entire amount of the sale price becomes taxable at that point. Why the other options are incorrect. B. GST will always apply to reimbursements for prepayments. GST does not apply to reimbursements for prepayments. These are not part of the taxable sale price. C. Under the Excise Tax Act, the seller is the party who is required to pay the GST. Under the Excise Tax Act, the buyer, recipient, is generally responsible for paying the GST, not the seller. D. All amounts found on the statements of adjustments are subject to GST. Only amounts on the statements of adjustments that form part of the purchase price are subject to GST. Not all amounts are taxable.